What are your scars? We all tend to have them, and in fact, scars come in all shapes and sizes. And they can be physical, they can be emotional, they can be hard-to-hide scars, they can be childhood scars. Scars are important, partially because they all tell a story. You ever been in a situation where somebody rolled up their pant leg and they show you their scar and they say, look at this baby, I got this one when I was attacked by a 400-pound rhinoceros in the jungles of Africa, and they go on to tell some wild story, right? We do that, right? Because our scars are part of us, and they're important to us. And every scar has a story. And we tend to like to tell some of these stories because, well, they portray us as survivors, as people who have overcome great challenges and obstacles. Although, when we're receiving those scars, we don't tend to feel that way, do we? We tend to feel the immediate pain of what we are going through. Scars are important. You know, I have many scars, and they're both physical and emotional. One of the most painful ones, or moments in my life, was when about 7 years ago, I was forced to leave a church that I had been pastoring. A situation had come very unexpectedly. It kind of blindsided me. And there were a couple of people that were upset with me, and they decided that I needed to go. And they had a campaign, and they told stories about me that were very exaggerated and not true. And all of a sudden, the people that I had been very close to, very intimate, had a great relationship with, all of a sudden started saying some very nasty things about me. And I was just taken aback. I couldn't believe, how is it that these people, these Christians, could say such ugly, untrue things about me? And I remember at the time praying and saying, God, just please change them. Make this situation better. And you know what? God didn't. And I had to leave. And it wasn't my choice. At the time, it was a horrible experience. And I kept thinking, that's it. I'm done with being a pastor. I'm done with being involved in churches. I'm done with everything. I was going to check out. And then it was some people in my life that kind of just gathered around me, and they cared for me. And then I started to receive a couple notes and letters from people who really appreciated me. And today I kept all of them. I have a big file. And whenever I get really upset, all I have to do is go and read some of those encouraging notes that people have given me. And they make all the difference. And when I look back at my story, when I tell that story, I can't help but also mention how I felt God caring for me throughout those moments and those times. In the midst of those scars, when I was receiving those scars, I wouldn't have been able to articulate that. I wouldn't have been able to really understand. But when I look back, it's amazing how well God took care of me throughout that time. And it's easy to say, well, if God loved me, He would never have put me through that. But I wouldn't be the same person today if it hadn't been for God's hand shaping me as I received those scars. Yes, indeed, scars are important. In fact, there's a New York Times writer who once wrote, he did an article about what suffering does. And he talks about, he points out that while we aim for maximizing happiness in life, when we talk about the past, we not only talk about the happiest of times, we also seem to gravitate towards talking about the times of suffering as well. It is often the ordeals that seem most significant, he writes. People shoot for happiness, but feel formed through suffering. Today's story is about the disciples, gospel stories about the disciples, and as they were gathering together after what happened to Jesus, as he had been betrayed and arrested and taken from them. And we find them huddling in a room all by themselves. The doors are locked. They're afraid of the authorities and what might happen to them. And I always find it interesting about they're afraid, and I'm sure one of the things, they're not just afraid of what the authorities are going to do to them, they're probably afraid about what Jesus is going to say to them when eventually he shows up. They already know that the tomb is empty at this point. The women have already told them that Jesus is alive and they've encountered him. But the disciples are still afraid, and they're still locked in a room. And they're afraid of a lot of things. And they might be just a little afraid of what happens when they finally meet Jesus, because they have their own scars about having betrayed and abandoned Jesus in his difficult time of need. So they're there, and they're in this room, and then Jesus shows up and he says, "Peace be with you." And I always think it's interesting that he says, "Peace be with you," and they hear the voice. Because remember last week, we learned that Mary, as soon as she heard the voice of Jesus say their name, she automatically recognizes him and she rejoices. But the disciples are a bit different. They're there, they hear Jesus' voice greeting them, and nothing. And then, all of a sudden, Jesus shows them his scars. And once they see his scars, then they begin to rejoice. They're not horrified. All of a sudden, then, everything is made real. And his scars were so important to them. They can't help but think it's because of his scars, it makes their scars and their woundedness all that different. It changes everything. Because if Jesus, despite his scars and all the woundedness that he has, was able to survive, then maybe, just maybe, they can survive as well. If Jesus, with all that the world threw at him, including death, was still alive, then maybe nothing that the world would throw at them could kill them as well. Jesus' scars were important. They were also important because they were signs of how much God truly loved them, and that their shame of having abandoned him was not going to be dominated. Their story was going to be dominated by a scarred, wounded God that loved them tremendously. Scars are important. Thomas, I always think it's a bad rap, because we always call him Doubting Thomas, and somehow he's the least faithful one of all, right? Thomas wasn't there, and Thomas openly acknowledges that he doesn't believe them. He's like, "Hey, right, unless I actually see and physically touch those holes in his side, I'm not believing your ghost stories. Just let me be upfront with you." That's Thomas's attitude, and we tend to look down on Thomas, call him the doubters. Yeah, right, because we have so much more faith, right? But the thing is Thomas is very representative of who most Christians are. We all doubt like Thomas. It's always hard to believe when you can't physically touch something. When it's not blatantly in front of you, it's so easy to forget. And so Thomas openly acknowledges, "These are my doubts. This is who I am." And you notice when Thomas meets Jesus, what does Jesus say? "Oh, you of little faith, how could you have not believed?" No, he doesn't say that. He says, "Welcome. Come. Put your hand inside me. If that's what you need, go ahead and do that." And of course, Thomas doesn't need to do that. He doesn't actually touch Jesus. As soon as he encounters Jesus, those doubts somehow melt away. But he didn't get to encounter Jesus right away like everybody else. It took some time. Somehow he needed to wrestle with his doubts. And he needed the community of God to surround him and not to condemn him for doubting, but to lift him up and say, "Come, just don't give up. Just come stay with us. You're still welcome here, even though you have doubts." Because you'll notice, into this whole little journey thing, Thomas has his doubts, and the other disciples don't reject him. They say, "You're still part of us. You're still one of us, even though you have doubts." Because doubts are normal. And as we are willing to acknowledge and voice our doubts, then our faith grows. And our faith grows only as we encounter Jesus. It's an amazing story, the story that we read today. And our theme for Easter is signs of hope and joy. And I think that one of the ways that I wanted to kind of kick off this whole Easter season celebration, and in each gospel story, we'll be looking for some kind of sign of hope and joy. And so I thought today, my sign of hope and joy was going to be scars. Because scars are what the disciples saw when they first saw Jesus. Scars are what Thomas needed to see. Because somehow scars make all the difference. And when we look at our scars, they can be signs of hope and joy. Not signs that God has abandoned us. Not signs that God has punished us. But signs that no matter what the world does to us, Jesus is greater and stronger than the scars, and the wounds, and even the death that this world gives us. Amen? So look at your scars. scars, those can be tremendous signs of hope and joy. There's so much more about this world. And even in the stories that we tell of our scars and how God forms us through the pain that this world gives us, and even the stories of the community that surrounds us as we receive those scars. Don't ignore or hide your scars, especially those emotional ones. Thomas had emotional scars. Peter had emotional scars. Because they were willing to voice them and to connect and encounter Jesus, they found healing, they found redemption. So don't be ashamed of your scars. Don't be ashamed of your doubts. Those, in and of themselves, are signs of hope and joy. Our takeaways for today. The Easter story is the story of a wounded God who alone can truly understand our wounds. And it's also the story of a God who, through his woundedness, can heal. Our second takeaway, nothing that wounds us can defeat God. And by showing us his scars, Jesus promised us that nothing that wounds us can defeat us. Nothing that might happen to us can defeat God, and nothing can defeat us as well. Amen. Let's stand for our hymn of the day, which is hymn number 364, Christ is Risen.